Two shadows. In Paris. The apartment breathed with the weight of two epochs, its modest space cleaved by an invisible meridian that separated worlds. Dawn crept through the narrow window, painting the cramped quarters in gradations of amber and rose, illuminating a tableau that defied the natural order of time itself. On the Ostern wall, military precision governed every surface. Maps spread across the plaster like papery skin. Europe fractured into territories of conquest. Trade routes marked in fading ink. Battle formations sketched in margins worn thin by contemplative fingers. Leather boots stood sentinel in perfect alignment, their brass buckles catching fragments of morning light like captured stars. Medals hung from wooden pegs, each one a crystallized moment of glory. Their ribbons faded, but still proud. The narrow bed lay stretched taut beneath a wool blanket, its corners sharp enough to slice the air. The western half whispered of different hungers. Philosophy volumes leaned against one another like old friends, sharing secrets. Voltaire conversing with Rousseau, Montesquieu nodding to newer texts whose spines bore unfamiliar names. A porcelain teacup sat poised on a writing desk, its surface unmarked by the chaos of creation, waiting. The desk itself held only essential implements: fountain pen, leather-bound journal, a small lamp whose brass base had acquired the patina of thoughtful use. Here, the bed remained unmade, its simplicity suggesting not carelessness, but the priorities of a mind that found order in ideas rather than objects. The figure on the eastern side stirred first, as he always did. Short in stature but immense in presence, he possessed the quality of compressed energy, a man built for decisive action. His hand reached automatically for the timepiece beside his pillow, checking the hour with the instinct of someone who had once synchronized the movements of armies. The morning ritual began without hesitation, feet touching the floor with military precision, spine straightening as if called to attention by invisible drums. He moved through his ablutions with the efficiency of campaign living. Water splashed against weathered features that had gazed across the pyramids of Egypt and the steppes of Russia. In the small mirror above the wash basin, gray eyes studied their reflection with the calculating intensity of a strategist surveying terrain. His hands, still quick despite their apparent age, arranged his appearance with meticulous care, every button aligned, every crease deliberate. The morning was a battle to be won through preparation and will. As he dressed, his gaze swept across the maps, tracing familiar campaigns with the muscle memory of conquest: Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. Each name a symphony of tactical brilliance, each victory a step in the grand design that had once seemed inevitable. His fingers paused over a chart of the Russian front, and for a moment, winter seemed to breathe through the apartment walls. But the moment passed. The past was prologue. The present demanded its own conquests. On the western side, awakening came like the slow unfurling of dawn itself. The taller figure emerged from sleep with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that consciousness was a gift to be received rather than seized. His movements carried the fluidity of a man comfortable in his own skin, unhurried by the urgency that drove his roommate. Where the other attacked the morning, this one welcomed it. He stood at the window, tall frame silhouetted against the Parisian skyline, and breathed deeply. The city stretched before him like a promise, its boulevards flowing like arteries of possibility, its rooftops harboring dreams in a dozen languages. His eyes, keen and thoughtful, trace the horizon where ancient stones met modern glass, where the weight of history pressed against the lightness of becoming. In this moment, he was both observer and participant, student and teacher. His morning routine unfolded with quiet intentionality. The teacup received its daily blessing of steaming liquid, the ritual as precise as any military drill, but softer in its execution. Steam rose like incense, carrying with it the promise of contemplation. He sipped slowly, each taste a meditation, each pause a recognition of the present moment's singular worth. The tea was Turkish, a bridge between worlds, between who he had been and who he continued to become. At his desk, he opened the leather journal and began to write. The fountain pen moved across cream-colored pages with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime translating thought into action through the alchemy of words. His handwriting flowed in elegant script, capturing observations, reflections, fragments of the perpetual conversation between past and future that occupied his waking hours. The city below provided endless material for contemplation, its contradictions, its possibilities, its eternal dance between tradition and transformation. Both men prepared to meet the day, though their destinations remained unspoken secrets, even to themselves. The shorter figure donned his coat with military bearing, every gesture economical and purposeful. His walk carried the rhythm of marching columns, the cadence of command. The city would bend to his investigation as territories once had to his armies, systematically, thoroughly, with the patience of someone who understood that intelligence was the foundation of all victory. The taller figure moved with different music. His stride carried the easy confidence of someone who had walked among both peasants and diplomats, who had learned that true leadership flowed from understanding rather than dominance. His coat hung loosely, comfortably, like the mantle of someone who wore authority as naturally as skin. Where his roommate conquered space, he inhabited it. Paris accepted them both into its morning embrace. The city's ancient stones had witnessed countless ambitions, absorbed innumerable dreams. Its streets curved and straightened with the logic of organic growth, defying the grid systems that more practical minds might prefer. Cafes exhaled the perfume of fresh bread and roasting coffee. Vendors arranged their wares with the artistry of those who understood that even commerce could be poetry. The shorter figure navigated the streets with tactical awareness, noting sight lines and choke points, cataloging the ebb and flow of human traffic with the eye of someone who had once moved armies across continents. His path wound through the city's heart with apparent randomness, but each turn served a purpose in the larger strategy of exploration. He paused at monuments, studying their inscriptions with the intensity of a general reading dispatches. History spoke to him in bronze and marble, whispering of glories won and lost. Meanwhile, the taller figure walked with the easy rhythm of someone following inspiration rather than itinerary. His route meandered through neighborhoods where university students debated philosophy over morning cigarettes, where immigrants from his homeland sold newspapers in their native tongue, where the old world pressed against the new in constant, creative tension. He stopped frequently, not from exhaustion, but from curiosity. A flower vendor's arrangement caught his eye. The argument of two elderly men over dominoes deserved observation. The laughter of children in a small park demanded appreciation. Both journeys converged, as fate or chance decreed, at a small square tucked between major boulevards, like a secret shared between friends. The space possessed the intimate scale of village life, preserved somehow within the metropolis's grand design. Plane trees spread their branches in protective canopy over worn stone benches. A fountain murmured its ancient song at the square's center, its water catching sunlight and scattering it in liquid diamonds. They arrived from opposite directions within moments of each other, two figures drawn by invisible threads to this unremarkable patch of Parisian earth. Neither acknowledged the other's presence immediately, yet each felt the weight of significance settling over the morning like morning mist. The shorter figure claimed a bench with clear sightlines to all approaches, his posture erect, hands clasped behind his back in the eternal stance of command. His eyes surveyed the square with tactical appreciation, noting its defensive possibilities, its vulnerabilities, its potential for both shelter and ambush. Even in repose, he radiated the coiled energy of someone prepared for action. The taller figure selected his seat with different criteria: proximity to the fountain's music, angle of sunlight, view of the human theater unfolding around them. He sat with relaxed attention, watching the morning's small dramas play out. A young mother negotiating with her reluctant toddler, an old man feeding pigeons with ceremonial gravity, two lovers sharing secrets on a distant bench. The fountain sang between them, its voice a bridge across the space that separated their chosen positions. Neither man moved to close the distance, yet neither could ignore the other's presence. They sat in parallel contemplation, two shadows cast by different suns, their morning routines complete. Their separate journeys converged into this single moment of shared solitude in the heart of a city that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of dreams, the eternal human dance between ambition and wisdom. The morning deepened around them, and Paris continued its ancient work of transformation, indifferent to the weight of history carried by two figures who had once reshaped the world and now found themselves sharing a single square, a single moment in the democracy of present time. Silent tension, loud symbols. The apartment welcomed them back with the familiar embrace of divided territory, but the morning's convergence had shifted something in the air. Where once the invisible meridian had been respected with careful neutrality, now it hummed with unspoken tension, each man's presence pressing against the boundaries of their shared space, like opposing magnetic fields. Napoleon returned first, his military punctuality unchanged by the morning's wandering. He moved with the same economic precision, but his actions carried new weight, each gesture a declaration. The remote control fell into his grasp with the authority of a scepter. The television screen flickered to life, revealing a documentary about the Napoleonic Wars. The narrator's voice filled the apartment with familiar cadences, strategy, tactics, the mathematics of empire. Maps appeared on screen, his maps, his campaigns, his victories dissected for modern consumption. He positioned himself in the worn armchair with the bearing of a throne, spine rigid, hands clasped behind his head in the pose of someone reviewing his own legacy. The volume crept higher, not from inconsideration, but from necessity. History deserved to be heard in full voice. Austerlitz played out in computer animation, tiny soldiers moving across digital terrain with the precision he had once commanded through flesh and blood. When Ataturk entered, the apartment's atmosphere thickened like storm air. He paused at the threshold, taking measure of the changed landscape. The television's martial music crashed against his ears, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Without acknowledgement of his roommate, he moved to the small kitchen area, where the morning's dishes waited in the sink like silent witnesses. His approach to washing was methodical but gentle, each plate receiving careful attention, water flowing in controlled streams rather than wasteful torrents. Steam rose from the basin, carrying with it the promise of renewal. He arranged the clean dishes in perfect alignment, not with military precision, but with the aesthetic consideration of someone who understood that beauty could be found in the simplest acts. The documentary shifted to Egyptian campaigns, and Napoleon leaned forward with renewed interest. Sand dunes filled the screen, pyramids casting shadows across digital approximations of his former domain. His fingers drummed against the chair's arm, not nervously, but with the rhythm of someone conducting an invisible orchestra of memory. Ataturk opened the refrigerator and began preparing lunch with deliberate care. Fresh vegetables emerged from the crisper drawer, tomatoes red as sunrise, cucumbers green as hope, onions white as possibility. His knife work possessed the fluid precision of someone who had learned that transformation began with the smallest acts of creation. Each slice fell with quiet purpose, building toward something larger than the sum of its parts. The aroma of olive oil warming in the pan began to compete with the television's soundtrack. Napoleon's nostrils flared slightly, recognizing the sense of the Mediterranean that had once marked the boundaries of his ambitions. But he did not turn from the screen, where animated battalions maneuvered through the shadow of the Sphinx. Ataturk reached for the salt, and his hand hesitated. The container sat precisely where Napoleon had left it after his morning eggs, not in the designated space they had wordlessly established, but closer to the military side of their invisible boundary. A message, perhaps, a claim. He moved the salt to its proper place, with movements that carried no anger, only quiet correction. The documentary's narrator began describing the continental system, Napoleon's economic warfare against Britain. Trade routes appeared on screen like arteries of empire, blockades marked in red like wounds across the map of Europe. Napoleon's chin lifted with vindication. Here was strategy that transcended mere battlefield tactics, vision that encompassed continents. From the kitchen came the gentle sizzle of vegetables meeting heat, the soft percussion of wooden spoon against pan. Ataturk worked with the concentration of someone composing poetry in olive oil and herbs. His movements flowed with the grace of practice, each stir a meditation on the transformation that heat and time could work upon simple ingredients. Napoleon rose during a commercial break, his body unfolding with military efficiency. He moved to the kitchen's edge, not encroaching upon Ataturk's domain, but establishing presence. His eyes cataloged the cooking process with tactical awareness, timing, technique, resource allocation. The pan's contents bubbled with Mediterranean sunshine, filling the apartment with memories of campaigns fought under foreign skies. Without looking up from his cooking, Ataturk reached for the pepper mill. His fingers found empty air. Napoleon had moved it. Not far, just enough to disrupt the established order. It now sat beside the military maps, as if spices too could be conscripted into service. The taller man's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. He retrieved the pepper mill without haste, his movements speaking volumes about boundaries respected and territories maintained. The mill returned to its designated place with the quiet authority of someone who had once redrawn the maps of nations. Napoleon returned to his chair as the documentary resumed, but his posture had shifted. Where before he had lounged with royal ease, now he sat forward, claiming space through presence, alone. The remote control found its way to the coffee table's exact center, positioned like a territorial marker between their divided realms. The cooking completed, Atatürk plated his meal with artistic consideration. Colors arranged themselves like flags of possibility: red tomato, green herbs, white cheese, creating harmonies that spoke of synthesis rather than conquest. He carried his plate to the small table by the window, where afternoon light transformed simple food into still life. His first bite carried ritual significance, a moment of gratitude that required neither prayer nor ceremony, but found both in the simple act of nourishment. The flavors bloomed across his palate like democracy across a willing populace. Complex, balanced, built upon foundations of mutual respect between ingredients. Napoleon watched from his peripheral vision, noting the careful ceremony, the aesthetic consideration given to something as mundane as lunch. His own relationship with food had always been utilitarian, fuel for the engine of ambition, consumed quickly between battles or during the brief respites that military life afforded. Yet something in his roommate's approach suggested different possibilities. The documentary moved to Waterloo, and the apartment's tension crystallized like frosted on glass. Animated armies converged across Belgian fields, the narrator's voice dropping to appropriate solemnity as it described the final campaign. Napoleon's hands clenched behind his head, knuckles white against dark hair. History's judgment played out in digital precision, reducing the complexity of empire to the simple mathematics of victory and defeat. Atatürk set down his fork and moved to his desk, where the afternoon's writing awaited. He opened his journal to fresh pages, fountain pen poised like a conductor's baton. But instead of words, he began to sketch, not battle plans or territorial acquisitions, but the view from their window. Paris spread across the page in flowing lines, its rooftops and spires rendered with the careful attention of someone who saw cities as living organisms rather than strategic objectives. The television's volume seemed to increase of its own accord, martial music swelling to fill the spaces between pen strokes. Napoleon gestured at the screen with proprietary pride as artillery positions were analyzed, as tactical decisions were dissected by modern military historians. This was his legacy speaking, his genius acknowledged by generations who had never heard cannon's thunder. But Atatürk's pen continued its quiet work, building Paris line by line, shadow by shadow. His sketch captured not the city's military significance, but its human poetry. Washing hanging between windows, pigeons gathered on windowsills, the gentle curve of streets that had grown organically rather than been imposed by central planning. The afternoon deepened, and with it, the apartment's silent argument. Every action became weighted with meaning, every choice a philosophical statement. Napoleon arranged his evening medications with military precision. Each pill assigned its proper formation. Atatürk watered the small herb garden he maintained on the windowsill, speaking to each plant in the language of touch and attention. The remote control migrated again, this time to Napoleon's side of the coffee table. A documentary about modern warfare began, featuring technologies that would have seemed like sorcery to both men in their original lives. Drones moved across distant skies, satellites tracked invisible enemies, computers calculated trajectories with inhuman precision. Atatürk closed his journal and moved to the bookshelf, selecting a volume of poetry. The binding was worn smooth by countless readings, its pages soft as fabric. He settled into the remaining chair, angling himself slightly away from the television's blue glow, creating his own island of contemplation within the apartment's charged atmosphere. The poetry collection fell open to familiar passages, words that had sustained him through the long work of nation-building. His lips moved silently, not reading but remembering, each verse a meditation on the patient work of transformation. Outside, Paris continued its ancient conversation between past and future, its streets bearing the footsteps of centuries while its people dreamed forward into possibility. Napoleon reached for his water glass and found it empty. The kitchen beckoned, but Atatürk's presence at the adjacent chair created a gravitational field of consideration. To rise would require acknowledgement, perhaps even the breaking of silence that had become its own form of communication. Instead, he endured thirst, as he had endured the snows of Russia, the heat of Egypt, the final loneliness of exile. Endurance was perhaps the only constant that had survived the translation from his former life to this strange present. Then came the soft whisper of paper sliding beneath their door. Both men turned toward the sound with the instinct of those who had lived through times when unexpected messages often carried the weight of kingdoms. An envelope lay on the worn floorboards, like a white flag of truce, official in its appearance yet somehow personal in its placement. Neither moved immediately. The envelope existed in the neutral territory of their threshold, belonging to both and neither. Finally, Atatürk rose, his movements carrying diplomatic courtesy. He retrieved the envelope with careful hands, noting its weight, its texture, the absence of any external markings that might indicate its origin. Napoleon muted the television with a gesture that somehow managed to preserve dignity while acknowledging curiosity. The apartment fell into expectant silence, broken only by the gentle tearing of paper as Atatürk opened their mysterious correspondence. Inside, a newspaper clipping yellowed with age, its edges soft as autumn leaves. The headline spoke in French that both men could read, though it carried different meanings for each. La liberté, freedom, liberty. The word stood alone, unmodified by adjectives or explanations, as pure as morning light. Atatürk held the clipping so both could see, his gesture unconscious but significant. For the first time since morning, their territorial boundaries dissolved into shared curiosity. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from nervousness but from recognition of the weight that single word could carry. Napoleon leaned forward in his chair, his military bearing softening into something more human. The documentary's frozen images of modern warfare seemed suddenly irrelevant compared to this fragment of older dreams. La liberté had been carved into the stones of his empire, painted on the banners of his armies, whispered by the peoples who had both welcomed and resisted his campaigns. For Atatürk, the word carried different resonances, not of conquest, but of awakening, not of imposition, but of cultivation. Liberty as the right of peoples to determine their own futures, to build societies that reflected their highest aspirations rather than their deepest fears. The clipping bore no date, no attribution, No context beyond that single, powerful declaration. It might have been torn from any newspaper in any era, a message that transcended time by embracing truth that remained constant across centuries. Both men stared at the fragment of newsprint, and in its yellowed surface they saw reflected their own dreams and disappointments, their triumphs and failures, their shared humanity despite the different paths they had taken towards similar goals. The apartment's tension began to shift, not disappearing but transforming into something more complex, more nuanced. The afternoon light streaming through their window caught the clipping's surface, illuminating the word until it seemed to glow with its own inner fire. And in that moment, without words or gestures, two legends found themselves standing on common ground, united by recognition of the idea that had driven them both, each in his own way, toward the difficult work of shaping history. One city, two minds, one vision. Dawn arrived differently this morning, its light falling across the apartment with the quality of absolution. The invisible meridian that had once cleaved their shared space remained, but its meaning had transformed overnight from barrier to boundary, a line that defined territories while acknowledging the sovereignty of the whole. Napoleon rose at his customary hour, but his movements carried a subtle alteration in rhythm. The military precision remained, yet softened somehow, as if overnight he had remembered that efficiency need not exclude grace. His morning ablutions proceeded with familiar discipline, but his eyes lingered longer at the mirror, seeing perhaps not just the strategist reviewing tomorrow's campaign, but a man considering the weight of accumulated days. Atatürk emerged from sleep with his characteristic deliberation, but today his awakening bore witness to change. He stood at the window as always, greeting Paris with quiet reverence, but his posture suggested reception rather than simple observation. The city spread before him not as subject for analysis, but as partner in dialogue. Its ancient stones and modern glass, speaking in harmonies he was only beginning to understand. Their morning rituals proceeded in parallel, but where once each man had claimed his space with territorial certainty, now they moved with an awareness of the other that bordered on choreography. Napoleon's boots found their alignment without disturbing the books that had somehow migrated closer to the territorial boundary. Atatürk's tea preparation included the gentle rattle of a second cup placed beside the first, not offered, but available. The newspaper clipping from the previous afternoon had found its way to the windowsill, where morning light transformed La Liberté into a daily benediction. Neither man had moved it there consciously, yet both acknowledged its presence with the reverence reserved for shared talismans. Without consultation or announcement, both men prepared for the street. Napoleon donned his coat with ceremonial care, each button a small commitment to the day's possibilities. Atatürk gathered his journal and pen, slipping them into his pocket with the unconscious gesture of someone who carried the tools of thought, like others carried keys. They reached the door simultaneously, paused in brief acknowledgement of the synchronicity, then stepped into the hallway together. Paris welcomed them with morning's democratic embrace. The city's streets held the accumulated dreams of centuries, each cobblestone worn smooth by millions of footsteps, each corner turned by countless souls seeking their own versions of liberty. They walked without destination, their pace naturally synchronizing despite differences in stride and intention. Their route wound through neighborhoods where history pressed against modernity, like lovers sharing whispered secrets. Past cafe windows where students debated philosophy over morning coffee, their voices carrying the same passionate intensity that had once filled the salons of revolution. Past markets, where vendors arranged their wares with unconscious artistry, their immigrant hands building new versions of ancient traditions. Napoleon's eyes catalogued the city's defensive possibilities with automatic precision, but also began to notice details that had escaped his tactical focus. The way morning light painted building facades in shades of cream and gold, the careful attention shopkeepers paid to their window displays, the small acts of courtesy that stranger offered stranger in the democracy of daily life. Atatürk observed with his characteristic synthesis of intellectual curiosity and human warmth, but found his attention drawn to patterns that spoke of organization and efficiency, the way traffic flowed through apparent chaos, the invisible systems that brought fresh bread to every corner, the quiet heroism of civil servants beginning another day of anonymous service. They paused at a monument neither had visited before. A bronze figure frozen in the act of writing, pen raised as if capturing divine inspiration. The inscription spoke of another revolutionary, another dreamer who had wielded words like weapons in service of human dignity. Both men studied the statue with professional interest, recognizing the familiar weight of legacy crystallized in metal and stone. A group of school children approached, their teacher pointing out historical details with enthusiastic pedagogy. The children clustered around the monument's base, some listening with rapt attention, others fidgeting with the restless energy of youth. One small girl placed her hand on the bronze boots, her touch unconscious but reverent, as if testing whether legends might retain some warmth of life. Napoleon and Atatürk exchanged their first direct look since the previous afternoon's revelation. In that brief meeting of eyes, recognition passed between them, not of each other but of themselves reflected in the monument's frozen grandeur. They had both stood where this bronze figure stood, elevated by history, yet somehow diminished by the translation from flesh to symbol. They continued walking, their route now trending toward the river, where Paris revealed its most intimate relationship with time. The Seine flowed with ancient patience, carrying on its current the reflections of Gothic spires and glass towers, bearing witness to the eternal conversation between what was and what might be. The Louvre rose before them like a temple dedicated to human achievement, its classical facade promising treasures accumulated across centuries of conquest, creation, and cultural exchange. They approached its entrance with the slightly hesitant steps of those who knew they might encounter their own images transformed into historical artifacts. Inside the museum's halls stretched like arteries through which flowed the blood of civilization. Tourists moved in streams, their cameras capturing fragments of beauty they would examine later in the safety of distant homes. But Napoleon and Atatürk moved with different purpose, seeking not souvenirs but understanding. They found themselves in the halls dedicated to the Empire period, where Napoleon's image appeared in paintings that transformed flesh into legend. David's magnificent portraits showed him crossing the Alps, receiving the Pope's blessing, standing amid the symbols of absolute power. The painted Napoleon bore little resemblance to the man who now stood before these canvases, yet the essential quality remained, that sense of compressed energy, of destiny embraced and wielded like a sword. The living Napoleon studied his artistic afterlife with complex emotions flickering across his weathered features. Pride mixed with melancholy, recognition tempered by the strange displacement of seeing oneself become artifact. His painted self gazed out from gilt frames with the confidence of someone who believed his vision could reshape the world, and had for a time been proven correct. In another wing, they discovered more recent acquisitions, photographs and documents from the Turkish War of Independence, maps showing the birth of modern Turkey from the ashes of empire. Atatürk appeared in these historical fragments as both soldier and statesman, his image evolving from military commander to nation builder to cultural revolutionary. The living Atatürk examined these records with the detached curiosity of an archaeologist studying ancient civilizations. Here was his own transformation, documented in fading photographs and yellowed documents. The process by which a man became a movement, how individual will could catalyze collective awakening. His younger face stared back from these historical fragments, eyes bright with the certainty that change was not only possible, but inevitable. They moved through the museum's maze-like corridors, encountering the accumulated treasures of human creativity. Sculptures that captured movement in marble stillness, paintings that froze light and emotion in pigment and varnish, artifacts that spoke of vanished civilizations and enduring dreams. Each room offered testimony to humanity's stubborn refusal to accept limitation, its endless hunger for beauty and meaning. In the wing dedicated to ancient civilizations, they paused before Egyptian sarcophagi and Mesopotamian tablets, relics of empires that had once seemed eternal, yet now existed only as museum displays. The irony was not lost on either man. They too had built empires, shaped destinies, commanded the loyalty of millions. Yet here they stood, anonymous visitors contemplating the fragility of even the most ambitious human constructions. As afternoon settled over the museum's quiet halls, they found themselves in a section devoted to the philosophy of governance. Display cases held documents that had shaped political thought across centuries, manifestos and constitutions, declarations and treatises. Here was humanity's ongoing attempt to codify its highest aspirations, to create systems that honored both individual dignity and collective welfare. One display case held a simple book, leather-bound and unremarkable, except for its title, Humanity. The volume lay open to a page dense with marginalia, previous readers' attempts to engage with ideas that transcended their particular moment in history. Beside the book, museum staff had placed writing materials, an invitation for visitors to add their own thoughts to the ongoing conversation. Napoleon and Atatürk approached the display with shared recognition. Here was the essential challenge that had driven them both: how to serve humanity's potential while acknowledging its limitations, how to build lasting institutions from the fragile materials of human nature. They found seats at the small table, positioned before the display, their movements unconsciously synchronized. The museum's afternoon quiet settled around them like a blessing, broken only by the distant footsteps of other visitors and the soft rustle of turning pages from scholars working in nearby alcoves. Atatürk reached for one of the provided pens, his fingers closing around it with familiar comfort. But instead of writing, he began to sketch on the blank paper provided by the museum. His lines flowed with practiced confidence. building not portraits or landscapes, but symbols, bridges spanning chasms, seeds sprouting into mighty trees, hands reaching across divides to clasp in understanding. Napoleon watched for a moment, then selected his own pen. His drawings emerged with military precision, yet surprising grace. Maps that showed not territories conquered, but territories connected. Roads that led not to battlefields, but to marketplaces and schools. Towers that served not as fortresses, but as lighthouses guiding ships towards safe harbor. Their sketches began to interact across the shared page, Napoleon's structured geometry complementing Atatürk's organic curves. Neither man directed this collaboration consciously, yet their individual visions began to synthesize into something larger than either could have created alone. Lines met and merged, symbols evolved and transformed, separate ideas flowering into unified vision. The open book seemed to approve of their joint effort, its pages bearing witness to yet another generation's attempt to answer eternal questions. Around them, the museum held its treasures in patient silence, stones and canvases and documents, all testifying to humanity's refusal to accept defeat, its endless capacity for renewal and growth. As the afternoon light began to fade through the museum's tall windows, both men set down their pens and studied what they had created together. On the page before them, their combined sketches had evolved into something resembling a garden. Not the formal geometries of Versailles or the utilitarian plots of military campaigns, but an organic space where structure and freedom danced in harmony, where individual plants grew according to their nature while contributing to the beauty of the whole. Neither man signed the drawing. It belonged not to them, but to the conversation that preceded and would follow them, another small contribution to humanity's endless dialogue with itself. They rose from the table with the satisfaction of work well done, leaving behind their anonymous gift for whatever visitor might next need inspiration. The museum's closing bells began to chime as they made their way toward the exit, their footsteps echoing through halls where the dreams of centuries stood preserved in glass and gold. Outside, Paris prepared for evening with its characteristic blend of grandeur and intimacy, its streets filling with workers heading home and lovers beginning their nocturnal celebrations. They walked back toward their shared apartment as the sun painted the city's rooftops in shades of amber and rose. Their morning's journey had taken them full circle, but both men recognized that circles, properly understood, were not repetitions but spirals, each revolution carrying them to higher ground, deeper understanding. The apartment welcomed them back with the warmth of familiar territory, transformed by new understanding. The invisible boundary between their spaces remained, but it no longer divided so much as it defined the complementary halves of a larger whole. As they prepared for evening, their movements carried the easy coordination of musicians who had found their rhythm, each playing his own part while contributing to a greater symphony. And on the windowsill, the newspaper clipping caught the last light of day, its single word, La Liberté, glowing like a promise kept, a vision shared, a legacy entrusted to hands still capable of building tomorrow from the dreams of yesterday.